What happens when a CEO orders a meal at his own diner and discovers the truth behind the smiles? No one knew his face. In the corporate world, the name Richard Bellamy carried weight, authority, precision, and a sharp vision that built an empire of over 21 restaurant branches across the United States. But he was never the kind of leader whose face adorned office walls or whose name appeared in glowing gold letters. He preferred to move in the shadows, to be the name spoken with respect, the unseen force that only made itself known when necessary. At 52, his features were defined: sharp eyes, a chiseled jawline, and an aura of quiet dominance that made people pay attention even when he was silent. He wasn't just observant, he lived in the details. 5 decades of life, 3 of them in the business world, had taught him one thing. Collapse doesn't begin with an explosion, but with small cracks that slowly widen. And today, he was facing one of those cracks. For weeks, reports had been piling up about a troubling decline in service at one of his Chicago branches. The complaints were no longer isolated incidents, but a pattern: slow service, unfriendly staff, food that no longer met the usual standards. Richard was not the kind of man who let things spiral out of control. He understood that every collapse began with small fractures, minor neglect here, a bad decision there, until the entire structure weakened. Sending a regional manager wouldn't solve it. He'd receive a sugar-coated report full of excuses. He didn't need reassurance. He needed the truth. So, he decided to go himself. But not as the CEO. Tonight, he would be just another customer. The air was crisp with the promise of rain. He parked his car a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. A gray jacket, worn jeans, scuffed sneakers. His hair, usually immaculate, was now styled into a deliberately unkempt look. A pair of simple glasses rested on his nose. Nothing flashy, nothing that hinted at his true identity. For a brief moment, he stood outside the restaurant, scanning its bright-lit facade. From the outside, everything seemed normal. The warm glow of the signage, the inviting scent of grilled meat wafting through the air, a small queue forming near the counter. But Richard didn't trust appearances. He stepped inside. Immediately, he felt it. Something was off. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. The unspoken tension, an atmosphere thick with something heavier than the usual dinner rush. He had been in enough high-pressure environments to recognize it. It was the feeling of a workplace on the edge, a battlefield where morale had already been lost. Moving carefully, he took in the scene with the practiced eye of a predator. The first thing he analyzed: the staff. The man at the counter was in his late 30s, with slicked-back dark brown hair and an air of irritation. He spoke to customers as if they were an inconvenience, his tone flat, his responses dismissive. Next to him, a young waitress, barely in her 20s, moved with frantic energy, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. She was trying to keep up, but she was drowning, clearly working beyond her limits. Then came the moment that shifted everything. When Richard approached the counter, his gaze flicked down to the name tag pinned to the unfriendly man's shirt. Mark Green, shift manager. So, this wasn't just a disgruntled employee. This was the manager himself. That changed everything. This wasn't about one rude server. This was systemic. Culture flowed from the top down, and if the manager was this indifferent, it meant the rot had already spread deep. Richard stepped forward, maintaining his calm demeanor. "What do you want?" Mark asked, voice devoid of warmth. No greeting, no pretense of customer service. "A double burger with fries," Richard said, keeping his tone neutral. Mark barely looked at him, scribbled down the order with deliberate slowness, then shoved the receipt toward him. Order number 47. Wait over there. Richard didn't move right away. A part of him, the CEO, the strategist, the man who had built this empire from the ground up, wanted to rip into Mark right then and there, to expose his identity, demand an explanation, and unleash the kind of controlled fury that made grown men sweat. But he didn't. Anger was only useful when wielded with precision. Instead, he took the receipt and moved to a side table, sitting down with the patience of a man laying a trap. Now, the true observation began. In the kitchen, the cooks were sluggish, chatting among themselves, oblivious to the growing line of customers. The young waitress was still the only one making an effort, while Mark barely moved from his spot. Then came the confirmation of everything he had suspected. When Mark called out Order 47, Richard rose from his seat to retrieve it. But just as he reached the counter, he noticed an elderly man standing beside him, holding a slip with the number 45, his food still nowhere in sight. The man hesitated, then spoke softly. "Excuse me, I think my order was before his." Mark barely spared him a glance. "You'll get it when it's ready," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Richard felt something inside him tighten, not just at Mark, but at himself. How had he allowed this culture to take root in one of his restaurants? How had this place become a reflection of everything he despised in bad leadership? This wasn't just a bad night, or a few disgruntled employees. This was a failure of leadership. And now, it was personal. Sitting back down, Richard no longer felt like an observer. He was a hunter now, eyes scanning every flaw, every broken piece. He needed to understand exactly how this place had decayed. Because soon, very soon, he was going to tear it apart and rebuild it from the ground up. Richard remained seated, watching in silence, his sharp eyes scanning every detail, every movement, every flaw that could reveal the true source of the neglect infecting his restaurant. He wasn't just looking for symptoms, he was searching for the root cause. He knew that no establishment collapsed overnight. It always started as a subtle infection, creeping through the cracks, unnoticed at first, until it became deeply embedded in the foundation. And here, in this restaurant, the signs of decay were everywhere. Customers waited with growing frustration, the kitchen staff worked without urgency, and the shift manager leaned lazily against the counter as if the world owed him something. Meanwhile, the young waitress, the only one who seemed to care, was running herself ragged, exhaustion etched into her face, her pale skin and dark-circled eyes betraying her fatigue. Richard took another bite of his burger, but his mind was elsewhere. Then he heard it. A voice from inside the kitchen. Not quite shouting, but tense, carrying the weight of frustration and exhaustion. It caught his attention instantly. He tilted his head slightly, focusing, trying to catch the words more clearly. "I'm doing my best. I haven't taken a break in 7 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." The waitress. Her voice was strained, trembling slightly, yet still holding on to a sliver of strength, like someone desperately trying not to break. Then came another voice, rough, cold, utterly devoid of empathy. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job." "Mark." Richard froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he had just heard. This wasn't just a bad moment. It wasn't the usual stress of a busy night. This was something else. A deliberate belittling, a calculated cruelty, a clear sign of a leader who failed by crushing those beneath him. Something hot and dark stirred inside Richard. Not just anger, but disgust. He left his half-eaten burger on the table and rose slowly. He moved with purpose, no longer paying attention to the customers around him, no longer thinking about the food or his cover. His focus had shifted entirely. Reaching the kitchen door, he hesitated for a brief second before pushing it open just enough to get a clear view inside. What he saw made his chest tighten. The waitress stood near the stainless steel prep table, shoulders slumped from exhaustion, head bowed, one hand quickly wiping at her face, trying and failing to stop the tears from falling. No one was helping her. Mark stood across from her, arms crossed, his expression blank, his posture radiating indifference, as if he enjoyed watching her break. At that moment, Richard realized this wasn't just an incompetent manager or an unmotivated employee. Mark wasn't just a problem in this restaurant. Mark was the disease itself. Richard stood, observing the kitchen with the sharp eyes of a hawk, capturing every detail as if analyzing a scene from a film whose ending he had yet to see. He watched the cooks work in silence, their hands moving mechanically, like mere cogs in a tired machine. There was no passion, no drive, only a routine obligation to keep the service running. Yet, there was something else. Something that told him this wasn't just an ordinary shift. They weren't comfortable. Their eyes weren't focused solely on their tasks, but flickered with hesitation, as if each of them was weighing the consequences of intervening in what was happening. They all saw how the waitress was being treated. They all knew something was wrong, but none of them wanted to be the one to step into the storm. Richard exhaled slowly, a habit he had developed over years of handling crises. Then, with a calculated step, he moved forward, letting the kitchen door swing behind him as he spoke in a calm yet authoritative tone. "Is there a problem here?" A heavy silence followed his words, the kind of silence that happens when a stranger walks into an unfair fight, and everyone pauses for a moment to decide how to react to his presence. Mark finally turned around, his expression scrutinizing. For a brief second, he seemed surprised that anyone had intervened, let alone a customer. But he quickly masked it, his eyes narrowing slightly with a hint of defiance. Richard had not revealed his identity yet. It wasn't time for that. Instead, he kept his tone neutral, his gaze steady on Mark, as if measuring him. "She needs a break. Why don't you let her sit down for a few minutes?" Mark didn't back down. If anything, he seemed to puff himself up slightly, as if trying to assert his authority over the situation. "We're short on staff. There's no time for breaks during peak hours." Richard didn't move. His expression didn't change, but inside, he was processing every word. This wasn't just about being short-staffed. This was exploitation, short-sighted, destructive leadership. He had seen this kind of manager before, the type who didn't understand that keeping a strong team was more important than running them into exhaustion. But he wasn't here to lecture. Not yet. Before he could respond, another voice spoke up, hesitant but carrying a spark of restrained courage. "She's been working non-stop since she clocked in. She hasn't even had a sip of water." Richard turned slightly toward the speaker, one of the cooks, a lean young man, his posture tense with nervous energy. He looked like someone who had held his words in for too long and had finally let them slip out. Mark was not pleased. He snapped his head toward the cook, his eyes flashing with sharp authority. "Stay out of it. Focus on your station." The cook swallowed hard, his shoulders subtly dropping as he turned back to his work. But he wasn't the only one who had noticed how he had been shut down. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt that oppressive control Mark was trying to impose. Richard watched the cook for a moment, then shifted his gaze back to Mark, his voice still calm, but carrying a dangerous edge. "You need to make sure your team can focus. Because, from where I'm standing, the pressure isn't coming from a lack of staff. It's coming from how this place is being run." For a split second, Mark's expression faltered. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even uncertainty, crossed his face. His cheeks reddened slightly, but he quickly tried to recover. "Look, I'm just doing my job." Richard wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, the waitress was still wiping her tears, trying to compose herself. Then, in a quiet, almost resigned voice, she said to Richard, "I'll be fine." She turned quickly toward the door, eager to escape the tension. But just as she was about to step out, Richard's voice stopped her. "Take a 10-minute break." She froze, as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly, as if no one had ever told her that before. Mark, on the other hand, was livid. He turned toward Richard, barely holding back his frustration. "Who are you to come in here and tell me how to run my shift?" Richard ignored the question, his eyes locked onto Mark's. He was studying him, testing his patience before asking, in a voice as steady as ever, "How long have you been working here?" Mark hesitated, then crossed his arms and replied with a smug air, 2 years. And I've kept this place running just fine, so I don't need some random customer telling me how to do my job." Richard didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply stated, "Your staff is exhausted. Customers are complaining, and you're berating them in the middle of their shifts. That's not management. That's chaos." Mark opened his mouth to argue, but Richard didn't give him the chance. "You need to think carefully, because I guarantee you, if I were your boss, this wouldn't work." Mark's face paled for a moment. A flicker of realization, of uncertainty, crossed his features before he quickly masked it with a scoff. Then, with a smirk, he said, "But you're not my boss, are you?" Richard didn't respond. He simply held Mark's gaze for a second longer, then glanced at the rest of the staff, taking in their expressions, their exhaustion, their silent frustrations. Then he turned toward the waitress, who had returned from her short break looking slightly better, though the fatigue still lingered in her eyes. Richard knew this confrontation wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Richard stepped out of the restaurant, letting the door close behind him slowly. But he didn't move right away. He stood for a moment, looking through the glass at the bustling scene inside. Chefs continued preparing orders, waiters moved between tables, and customers chatted without a care. It was a familiar sight, yet tonight he saw it through different eyes. These restaurants represented his dream, something he had invested years of effort into. But now he realized that dream had become distorted. Finally he turned, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. Within seconds, Julia's quick and efficient voice answered. "Sir, how can I assist you?" His voice was calm but firm as he said, "Clear my schedule for tomorrow. No meetings, no calls, nothing. Also, I need every employee file from this location. Performance reviews, notes, anything we have on the staff. And make sure all regional managers are ready for a meeting. We need to talk." Julia didn't hesitate. She was used to executing his instructions without question, but something in his tone made her realize this wasn't just a routine request. "Understood. Anything else?" Richard cast one last glance at the restaurant, taking in the walls that suddenly felt colder than he remembered. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "No. That's all for tonight." And he ended the call. The next day, Richard arrived at the restaurant right after opening, wearing the same simple disguise as the night before. This time, he wasn't here to sit on the sidelines. He was here to take action. The morning shift was quieter, but exhaustion still hung in the air. He spotted the waitress from last night moving between tables, her steps slower, her expression weighed down by fatigue. She passed by him carrying a coffee pot when he looked up and called out gently, "Hey!" She hesitated, then responded quickly, "Do you need something?" Keeping his tone casual, he asked, "Do you have a minute?" She glanced at the waiting customers, then sighed. Sure, but I don't have much time. We're short-staffed again. Richard nodded in understanding, then said, I won't keep you long. I just wanted to ask, how long have you worked here? She looked surprised by the question, but answered simply, 10 months? But why? Leaning forward slightly, Richard lowered his voice. I see that you're carrying a lot on your shoulders. Is this always the case? She glanced toward the kitchen window as if searching for the right words, then said, Not always. Sometimes it's the customers. Sometimes... She trailed off suddenly, biting her lip. Mark, isn't it? Richard asked gently. Her head snapped up, and for a moment, she looked panicked. You don't have to say anything. But Richard interrupted in a soft tone. I just want to understand. She took a deep breath, then spoke in a weary voice. We're always understaffed. When things get hectic, it gets worse. I know Mark is under pressure too, but we're the ones who pay the price. Before Richard could respond, Mark walked into the dining area, and the atmosphere tensed instantly. He noticed how the waitress stiffened and quickly turned away to refill a customer's coffee. Moments later, a customer raised his voice in irritation. This egg is overcooked. The waitress immediately apologized, offering to replace it right away. But the man, already in a bad mood, snapped, Can you people just get it right the first time? Her face flushed, but she remained composed. I'm very sorry about that. I'll fix it immediately. Suddenly, Mark stormed over, his tone sharp as he barked, What's the problem here? The customer waved dismissively. She's handling it. But Mark didn't care. Instead, he turned to the waitress, his voice dripping with frustration. How many times do I have to tell you to check the plates before they go out? This is basic. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech, drawing everyone's attention. That's enough. His voice was quiet, but carried undeniable authority. Mark turned, glaring. And who the hell do you think you are? Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and flipped it open, revealing his company ID. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone watched in stunned disbelief. Then, in a calm but weighted tone, Richard said, I'm Richard. I own over 20 restaurants, including this one. Mark's breath hitched, his expression shifting from anger to unease. He took a step back, but Richard wasn't done. The toxic environment you've created here has seeped into everything: the staff, the service, and the customer experience. You are the root of this failure. Mark opened his mouth, likely to defend himself, but his words faltered. He stared at the floor, knowing he had no real excuse. Richard didn't give him a chance to recover. Instead, he said in a cool, decisive voice, This job isn't easy, but that doesn't give you the right to treat your employees this way. Mark swallowed hard. Then Richard delivered the final blow. You're fired. The restaurant fell silent. A hushed murmur began to spread among the employees. Mark didn't argue. He knew the battle was over. Richard turned to the waitress, then looked at the rest of the staff and finally announced, Starting today, things will change, and there will be no place in this company for anyone who doesn't know how to lead with respect. Then he turned back to the waitress and gave her a reassuring smile. And you, I think you deserve a promotion. She looked stunned for a moment, then covered her mouth with her hands as tears welled up in her eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of exhaustion. They were tears of relief. Today was a new beginning. For everyone. If you like the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell button to receive all that is new.